Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Junior English. We now turn in your hymnals to 1417 and beyond. Rita Dove's essay, For the Love of Books. Let's read a little bit about this great American writer, born in 1952. First of all, heading Education. Rita Dove was born in Akron, Ohio, to highly educated parents. Encouraged to read from an early age, Dove excelled in school. Upon graduating from high school, she was invited to the White House as a presidential scholar. After her first writing efforts at the age of 9 or 10 had been comic books, although her first writing efforts at the age of 9 or 10 had been comic books with female superheroes, she turned to poetry in college. She attended Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, graduated with highest honors, winning a Fulbright scholarship to study in Germany. From there, she continued her education at the famous Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa. Teacher and Poet Laureate. Next heading. While teaching creative writing at Arizona State University, Dove gained critical acclaim with several volumes of poetry. In '87, she won the Pulitzer Prize for Thomas and Beulah, a collection of poems based on the lives of her grandparents. In '93, she was appointed Poet Laureate of the United States. We read earlier about these Poet Laureates, becoming the youngest person ever to hold that position. She has published many volumes of poetry since, including On the Bus with Rosa Parks in 1999 and America Smooth 2004. Dove's also written a play, a novel, collection of short stories. Quote, "Every time I write a poem," Dove said, "I try to imagine the reader that I was, curled up on the couch at the moment of opening a book and absolutely having my world fall away and entering into another one," end quote. I also like her quote at the very bottom of page 1417, "Poetry is language at its most distilled and most powerful." Let's turn now to her essay, For the Love of Books. We've said this before, and let's go ahead and just write it down again. All great writers will always give you, if you want to be a writer, the first advice is read. Read. You have to be a reader and read lots and lots of things. Don't just read one genre, for example. Read lots and lots of things. And we're going to hear about Rita Dove's suggestion here about her love of books. In this essay, Dove vividly communicates her love of books and the crucial influence that passion had on her decision to become a writer. As a young child, remember, we're working again with a reflective essay. Dove adored books, not just reading them, but holding them, smelling them, turning their pages. As she matured to discover the magic of language and the places it could take her, Dove encountered many literary voices. When she met a real writer like John Ciardi, the possibility of living her adult life among these literary voices and perhaps adding her own to others, to theirs, became startlingly and wonderfully tangible. So we're going to get here in a reflective essay, Rita Dove kind of expressing why it is that she became the writer that she became. Now, we're going to challenge you to actually read along with the reading. Pay attention. Practice your fluidity. See if you can, for example, conquer monkey mind while you have a tendency maybe to start thinking about other things. Really see if you can focus here. We're trying to improve ourselves as readers and thinkers. Let's go to it now. For the Love of Books.
For the Love of Books by Rita Dove. When I am asked, what made you want to be a writer? My answer has always been books. First and foremost. Now, then, and always, I have been passionate about books. From the time I began to read as a child, I loved to feel their heft in my hand and the warm spot caused by their intimate weight in my lap. I loved the crisp whisper of a page turning, the musky odor of old paper, and the sharp, inky whiff of new pages. Leather bindings sent me into ecstasy. I even loved to gaze at a closed book and daydream about the possibilities inside. It was like contemplating a genie's lamp. Of course, my favorite fairy tale was 1001 Nights. Imagine buying your life with stories. And my favorite cartoons were those where animated characters popped out of books and partied while the unsuspecting humans slept. In books, I could travel anywhere, be anybody, understand worlds long past and imaginary colonies in the future. My idea of a bargain was to go to the public library, wander along the bookshelves, and emerge with a chin-high stack of books that were mine. All mine for 2 weeks, free of charge. What I remember most about long summer days is browsing the bookshelves in our solarium to see if there were any new editions. I grew up with those rows of books. I knew where each one was shelved and immediately spotted newcomers. And after months had gone by and there'd be no new books, I would think, okay, I guess I'll try this one. And then discover that the very book I had been avoiding because of a drab cover or small print was actually a wonderful read. Louis Untermeyer's Treasury of Best Loved Poems had a sickeningly sweet lilac and gold cover and was forbiddingly thick. But I finally pulled it off the shelf and discovered a cornucopia of emotional and linguistic delights, from the Ballad of Barbara Frietchie, which I adored for its sheer length and rather numbing rhymes, to Langston Hughes's dazzlingly syncopated Dream Boogie. Then there was Shakespeare, daunting for many years because it was his entire oeuvre, in matching wine-red volumes that were so thick they looked more like oversized bouillon cubes than books. And yet it was that ponderous title, The Complete Works of William Shakespeare, that enticed me, because here was a lifetime's work, a lifetime, in 2 compact, dense packages. I began with the long poem, The Rape of Lucretia. I sampled a few sonnets, which I found beautiful but rather adult, and finally wandered into the plays. First, Romeo and Juliet, then Macbeth, Julius Caesar, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night. Enthralled by the language, by the fact that poetry was spinning the story. Of course, I did not understand every single word, but I was too young to know that this was supposed to be difficult. Besides, no one was waiting to test me on anything, so, free from pressure, I dove in. At the same time, my brother, 2 years my senior, had become a science fiction buff. So I'd read his analog and fantasy and science fiction magazines after he was finished with them. One story particularly fascinated me. A retarded boy in a small town begins building a sculpture in his backyard using old and discarded materials: Coke bottles, scrap iron, string, and bottle caps. Everyone laughs at him, but he continues building. Then one day, he disappears, and when the neighbors investigate, they discover that the sculpture has been dragged onto the back porch and that the screen door is open. Somehow, the narrator of the story figures out how to switch on the sculpture. The back door frame begins to glow, and when he steps through it, he's in an alternate universe. A town, the mirror image of his own, even down to the colors, with green roses and an orange sky. And he walks through this town until he comes to the main square, where there is a statue erected to, who else? The village idiot. I love this story. The idea that the dreamy, mild, scatterbrained boy of one world could be the hero of another. And in a way, I identified with that village idiot because in real life, I was painfully shy and awkward. The place where I felt most alive was between the pages of a book. Although I loved books, for a long time I had no aspirations to be a writer. The possibility was beyond my imagination. I liked to write, however, and on long summer days when I ran out of reading material or my legs had fallen asleep because I had been curled up on the couch for hours on end, I made up my own stories. Most were abandoned midway. Those that I did bring to a conclusion, I neither showed to others nor considered saving. My first piece of writing I thought enough of to keep was a novel called Chaos, which was about robots taking over the earth. I had just entered 3rd or 4th grade. The novel had 43 chapters, and each chapter was 20 lines or less because I used each week's spelling list as the basis for each chapter, and there were 20 words per list. In the course of the year, I wrote 1 installment per week, and I never knew what was going to happen next. The words led me, not the other way around. At that time, I didn't think of writing as an activity people admitted doing. I had no living role models. A real writer was a long-dead white male, usually with a white beard to match. Much later, when I was in 11th grade, my English teacher, Miss Oaksner, took me to a book signing in a downtown hotel. She didn't ask me if I'd like to go. She asked my parents instead, signed me and a classmate, who is now a professor of literature, out of school one day, and took us to meet a writer. The writer was John Ciardi, a poet who also had translated Dante's Divine Comedy, which I had heard of vaguely. At that moment, I realized that writers were real people, and how it was possible to write down a poem or story in the intimate sphere of one's own room, and then share it with the world.
All right, let's turn now to this essay, and just make some quick observations at level 1. Of course, it's a fairly simple essay where Rita Dove is going to speak about why it is she became a writer, and more particularly how reading became the lifeblood to the profession that she ultimately pursued as a writer. Notice that she will begin early on page 1418 by saying, in books, it's a great line, you're halfway down on page 1418, in books I could travel anywhere, be anybody, understand worlds long past and imaginary colonies in the future. So she makes the observation that early on she loved everything about books, their ability to transport her, the physical, their relationship to the book itself, the way she could hold on to it, the way it smelled if it was old or new, the fact that it had leather covers. She then talks about some of the volumes that were intimidating to her. I've had students that say they completely identify with what she's saying. So, for example, I've had, it seems often it's boys, not always, but often boys, who will confide that when they were in middle school and they were told they had to do a book report, all they did was walk into the library and find the skinniest book they could. They picked down the skinniest book because they assumed that the skinniest book would be the easiest book, and therefore they would be able to get through the garbage of having to read the book. Intimidated, in other words, by big books. And she admits as much as well. But notice what she says. She was too young to realize that she was supposed to be learning something from these books. And so she just simply picked up Shakespeare and just started reading it, just for fun. Of course, she also points out, did you notice this? No tests involved. In other words, she wasn't being told, you need to read this so you can pass a test. She simply loved to read. Maybe we would say it this way. She learned to love ideas through reading books. I think that's a significant insight for us to debate here in a little bit. Because we are going to ask this question at 3B. Do you think times have changed? Do you think that it's a different time today? Did you grow up maybe even in a different time? For example, a lot of people love to read, but they read on their phone or on a reader, right? Or on an iPad or a Kindle reader. They don't even pick up the physical book anymore. You can have thousands of books right there on your phone, can't you? That you can just download through a Kindle reader and, for example, read. Do you think it's the same thing? So we're going to ask questions like this. Finally, she makes the observation at the very end of this essay that it was all about a teacher in her life who took her to a book signing of John Ciardi, the translator of, among any number of other things he did, the translator of Dante. And when she met a real-life writer, it told her that the things she loved to do could actually be considered legitimate. And then she could kind of maybe feel affirmed in some way and go forward. So that's level 1. Let's now jump to level 2. And let's ask about messages and themes in a reading like this. Maybe let's come up with a few for ourselves that we can list. One obvious message in this is that books are remarkable because they share ideas. And the human mind is fundamentally curious. right? For example, if you say to a young child of 10 years old, I know something or a secret you don't know, what's the child's immediate response? Tell me. I want to know. What? Tell me. Right? And if you grew up, for example, with any kind of an adult in your life who was a reader, you probably began to be turned on to reading because that adult in your life shared ideas with you and books. Somehow books can become the escape, but books can also become life-affirming. And they can begin to help us kind of work through the garbage of our life, especially as we start to get older and we have garbage in our life. I mean, when we're really young, we don't have as much garbage in our life. But by the time we hit middle school, we got a lot of garbage in our life. Stuff we're trying to deal with. Books have the ability to help us to relate. A second major message is the challenge of overcoming fear in relationship to books. I have students who will admit that when they were in elementary school and the teacher said, take out our books we're going to read today, they would get this horrifying feeling inside of them. We're going to read silently, for example, and the student would sit there and do this through the book, through the story. We're going to read this 5-page story. And the student, I've had students who confided this to me. This is what they did. They would read like this and then flip the page really fast and then flip the page and then get done, slam the book shut really loud so everybody would turn around and look at them and go, whoa, you're a fast reader. Whoa, you're smart. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Never learned to read. Found some way to make it into high school, stumbled into 303, and I finally looked at them and said, dude, you can't read, huh? I mean, of course you can read when you go to the grocery store and you need to figure out which brand of popcorn you're going to buy, and so you start reading about it. Of course you can do that. And of course you can navigate some of the reading that you have to do for the stuff you love to do, like play a video game. But if you had to pick up a book and just read it from start to finish, if you had to pick up some piece of writing and read it, you struggle, huh? As a matter of fact, you can't concentrate long enough to just get the information, huh? And the student would go, it's very true. I kind of fooled myself all these years because I was ashamed. I was intimidated. The smart kids knew how to read, and I couldn't read so well, which made me not smart, made me dumb, which is, of course, completely insane because I could give you something to read in Russian, and if you don't know Russian, you can't read it. Does that make you stupid? No, not at all. The fact that you can't read does not make you dumb. The fact that you can't read makes you limited. There's the key. And of course, once you're limited, you're kind of crippled in some way. And once you're crippled, you know it, whether nobody else knows it. So the challenge, of course, is to overcome our intimidation. Notice how she speaks about it. She decides to pick up Shakespeare. Notice how she approaches Shakespeare. She reads a couple of small things and then decides finally to just jump right into the plays themselves. Some of my students have said, how could a kid enjoy reading Romeo and Juliet? They made me read that when I was a freshman and I hated it. Notice she started when she was young and she didn't know she was reading something that is not supposed to be enjoyable. So for her it was enjoyable. A third message. We become what we see. Models are huge for us in our life. I've had ball players who say, the most influential person in my life was a coach. That's why I want to be a coach. I've had students that say, I watched someone on TV, I saw what they did, and I wanted to be just like them. From the time we're young, we start looking at our models to ask, what am I going to be when I grow up? Now, this is a fascinating question for juniors. Very quickly, of course, if it hasn't already happened for you, the adults in your life are going to begin to ask about what you do after you graduate. And of course, one of the fundamental questions is, are you going to college? What are you going to be when you grow up? This is kind of one of those penultimate questions that juniors and seniors in high school loathe to constantly hear. Of course, one of the ways that we start thinking about what we're going to be when we quote-unquote grow up is to look around at the people we've known. We become like our models. Notice in our essay the power of a teacher who takes 2 children out of school to go to a book signing. By the way, a book signing is when a writer has published a new book and then sits someplace, often in a bookstore, and then signs the new books. It's a way to sell your book. People buy your book, but they come up and they give the book to the author, and then the author signs it. And of course, then it becomes kind of like a meaningful kind of purchase at that point. So this, as a child, Rita Dove, think about this, the youngest poet laureate in the history of America. As a child, a teacher takes her time to say, come on, we're going to a book site. Did you notice, by the way, it's very subtle in the essay, the other student that went with her became a professor of literature later in his life. Whoa! Think about the significance that an adult can have in the life of a child by simply saying, come on, this is what we're going to do. By the way, notice she didn't even ask the kid, didn't ask Rita to ask her parents and said, this is what we're going to do. How compelling is that? Let's jump really quickly now to 2B. And notice at least that this is, again, a reflective essay. Notice how good reflective essays bring you, the reader, kind of into the essay. And then you kind of begin to identify, right? We could make this observation, so we'll do it. If we define in 303, and we do, learning as the ability to connect or relate new information to old information. When I'm teaching you a new concept, you go, oh, that's kind of like this other thing I already know. That's what we call learning. It's not memorization. Right? Learning is not memorization. It's this ability to connect new to old. What we could say about reading is that you learn when you read, when you can begin to identify in some way with the reading. And in a reflective essay, the way we identify is to say, oh yeah, that happened to me. When we're reading a short story or a novel, we identify maybe with a character. In the story, who are you most like? Who are you most not like? In the story, who do you really dislike, the antagonist? Or who do you have some sympathy, or as Aristotle calls it in Poetics, some kind of pathos for, some kind of feeling towards the protagonist, right? And then you can begin to identify in some way with the text. Can I say this out loud? If you say you hate to read, it is not that you hate to read. It is that you have not yet found a text with which you can identify. That is a huge observation.